Well, here's the dynamic that existed in the Iowa House. They had a group of conservative Democrats called the Six Pack, and the way the House is set up is 56 Democrats and 44 Republicans. But this Six Pack, over the last 4 years, have caused all kinds of heartburn for the pro-labor agenda. Those folks are very, very popular in their home districts, but they are conservative Democrats, but they're D's and name only. They're conservative people, but they tend to have, and so what happened was the Iowa Speaker of the House, Patrick Murphy, Democrat from Dubuque, would be unable to herd them in to caucus to get the requisite number of votes to get many of these labor initiatives out of the House of Representatives. The Iowa Senate, which has broken up 32 Democrats to 18 Republicans and led by Iowa Senator Mike Ronstall, Democrat from Council Bluffs, they easily would have had that because of the disparity in the number. But these six-pack was the reason why the pro-labor agenda didn't go anywhere, and quite frankly, it's the reason why the labor folks are so terribly upset with the current governor.
Which is the reason why they're not going to be real excited about working to re-elect Democrats. So I think, the politics is pretty puzzling. But one of those four pieces actually did pass the previous session, and then the governor, rather inexplicably, from a political perspective, vetoed it. So yeah, it hasn't been a good 4 years for the labor agenda.
That's a very good question. I think maybe the better question is, how do you make it friendly to those people who would lose their job? Because in the final analysis, it all becomes parochial. Well, if you've got County X and County Y right next to each other, and you know that you only want one assessor or one auditor or one county clerk, that means that somebody in that respective county loses their job. Where are you going to put them? And I think that's the problem that a lot of people have had is we'd love to share services and combine mental health perhaps, and combine our court systems, and combine even so much as combining teachers from an educational perspective. But many of those positions, whether it be in county government or in the school districts, are some of the best jobs in the respective communities, and so nobody wants to go away. I know that I just cited the Mitch Daniels approach in Indiana of scaring the folks to put their heads together in a back room, otherwise they're not going to get state funding. There's something to that, but the pivotal thing is to be able to do something for that person or persons that lose their job as a result. But again, your question is excellent, and I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. For Iowa to be progressive and to take the next step, and for your generation to come in as leaders and millennials and the like, you're going to have to figure out how to make things a little bit smaller and more productive than having larger municipalities and counties and having things be unproductive.
I want to sort of put a spotlight on a different way in which each of you approach the same point. Peter made the point in his presentation that the business tax burden is essentially marginal to the cost of doing business, particularly to location decisions. But I think you had a very different view, and certainly your organization has a different view on the importance of business tax burden and business climate in the state of Iowa. So if you could comment on, where Iowa sits in a national picture and what you think we should or should not do in terms of reforming the business tax structure.
Well, we don't have real good recent measures of the overall level of business taxation. There's a few that are a few years old that show that we're pretty competitive, pretty average. I think if you look at something like the research activities credit, you should ask, do we need to be the most generous in the country in particular? Maybe we're not the most generous, but we're certainly up there, one of the few that allows that credit to be refundable. So we have a situation where a company, as it was explained to me by a legislator, we need to keep it refundable because otherwise it's not worth anything to some of our big companies. Why is that? Well, because they're not paying any taxes to begin with. We have a pretty favorable corporate income tax system. They're not paying any corporate taxes. They're paying local property taxes, paying some sales taxes. You don't pay taxes on your income earned in Iowa unless you sell to Iowa. So companies, like John Deere has a plant in Des Moines that makes cotton harvesters, and I'm pretty sure they don't sell any of those in Iowa, which means they don't earn any income from that plant in Iowa, which means they don't pay any corporate tax on the income from that plant in Iowa. So they don't get benefit from a tax credit unless the credit actually comes back to them in cash. Because if it just reduces their tax bill to zero, well, they're already there. So I think you have to ask the question, if a company that does a lot of research and requires an educated workforce and needs a good public school system to attract scientists and engineers to Iowa because they want their kids to have a good school system, shouldn't they be paying taxes to the state to support the education system that their workers' families use and that has trained their workforce? Do we really need to have the most generous research activities, or one of the most generous ones in the country? If we cut it in half, would we really lose any research activity? Rockwell Collins is not a company that can survive without doing research. And I don't think anyone believes that if we had no research credit, they wouldn't do any research. They'd go out of business quickly if they didn't do any research. So the proposal of the Governor's Commission wasn't to eliminate these credits. It was to put a cap on them, just to scale them back like everything else was scaled back in state government. When we're laying out 500 or 600 DHS social workers, why shouldn't some of the business recipients of tax credits bear at least a 10% cut in some of the credits they're getting? I'm confident we wouldn't have lost a thing by cutting those credits 10% like everybody else got cut.
The thing I'd say, just with regard to the question on location decisions, it's transportation, skilled and educated workforce, access to markets, and tax burden. Those are the things that people look at, decision makers, CEOs, CFOs. But the one thing that I find disheartening are those that say, well, access to markets and skilled workforce simply trump that of the tax burden. And I'm here to tell you, in sitting in meetings with CEOs and sitting in meetings with decision makers, the tax liability or potential tax liability is weighed heavily in a decision of whether or not to locate in Iowa or some other Midwestern state or some other part of the world. You guys are in school now and going to finish up. You know very well that we're in a globalized economy. And for me, I can't help but harp on the globalization of research and development. Many of these research jobs that take place for either John Deere, Rockwell Collins, or any of these other large corporations could be done somewhere else in the United States or somewhere else in the world. Every single one of these companies, Vermeer, to name another one, they have research facilities in Brazil, Asia, China, all these different parts of the world, and they can do it for less. Because they are good jobs, they're good paying jobs, we want to keep them in Iowa. And yes, Peter's right, we do have a very generous research activities credit. We have an existing credit administered by the Iowa Department of Revenue, and then we have something called a supplemental that's administered by the Iowa Department of Economic Development. But what it does is it incentivizes research growth in Iowa in industries that really do take place in other parts of the world. We want to keep those certainly in place. Refundability is a tricky thing. Yeah, you may not have any corporate income tax liability because you've got enough exemptions, but you have a heck of a property tax burden, especially if you've decided that you want a headquarter here in Iowa and hire hundreds of thousands of Iowans to work at your facility. The corporate income is one thing, but the one thing that often gets lost in the equation is the property tax paying piece as well. But in going back to the question at hand, location decisions are heavily swayed by tax liabilities and tax burdens.
Well, you're going to tell me that Rockwell County's got a check next year for $9 million instead of $10 million. They've moved their research to Indiana or somewhere.
Well, I think that Rockwell, as many of you know, based in Cedar Rapids, is a defense manufacturer. They do avionics for airplanes and things that fly in the air. Why are they in Cedar Rapids, Iowa? Why aren't they in California, where all the planes are, where they do the testing? Well, do they just here because they want to be here? No, because they've made a long-term investment to be here and be sustainable, and because, yes, we have a generous credit program, but we, as a state, benefit because they hire tens of thousands of folks to work in Cedar Rapids and other parts of the state, and those are jobs that otherwise would go away. So it's easy to get confused about the issue, but I will say this. It is an arms race in a globalized economy to keep those kinds of jobs and to have folks like yourself, as soon as you graduate, at least have the ability to find yourself in one of those jobs. Go ahead, Peter.
Isn't the fair tax a flat tax?
Yeah, that's what he asked.
What?
Isn't it a little bit different where they rebate, basically they take, so everybody pays like 17%, and then they take the rest of that, they support families basically, and take them up to the poverty level?
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to describe vaguely as a kind of flat tax. It's not completely flat because, as you say, there is an exemption or some money going back to people at the bottom end of the income distribution. But it's still, I guess you can do it either way. Taxing 17%, but then give some of it back if their income is below a certain level, or just leave the first $20,000 or whatever free of tax. Tax everything above that 17%. One of the things I've seen is that the rates that have been put out there sound pretty attractive, but are pretty unrealistic. They actually have to be substantially higher. And the other thing I would point out is that if you look at the overall tax system, remember that last graph, I'm talking about monkeying around with one part of it, about a third of it, the federal income tax. And you might like the idea of a flat tax, that proportionality has some appeal to it. Everybody should pay the same percentage of their income. In order to achieve that, though, with all the regressive taxes that we have in the system, the sales tax, the property tax, payroll taxes, excise taxes, you need to counterbalance that with a progressive income tax to come out with something that approaches proportionality. So if you really took the flat tax principle that everyone should pay the same percentage of their income, you wouldn't eliminate a progressive rate structure in the income tax. And I think the reason why they focus on the income tax betrays their real motives, which is to reduce progressivity, reduce the tax burden on the top incomes.
I think Peter's got a point. I just I was your age in 1996 when Steve Forbes ran for president, and that's all we heard over and over and over again was flat tax. And he was able to demonstrate with charts and graphs how great it was going to be, and how it was much fairer. And an ordinary working man or working woman would certainly be able to understand it a little bit better than they do now. But I think the fruit has come to bear, and with the liabilities that we have on the federal level, I don't see that as something that's going to get the light of day anytime soon. I will say this, though, there are a lot of Republican conservative activists who will never let it die. They're always going to be talking about fair tax and flat tax and talking about major reforms of that nature. But as a kind of an editorial point, as long as we have the federal liabilities that we have and we continue our deficit spending, I don't see flat tax seeing the light of day.
You want to take that one?
Well, perhaps. I'm not terribly familiar with. Now, is your next step law school, I hope? Maybe? Maybe. Okay.
Do you have a lot of unlawful income?
Anything you'd care to report? No. There's some reporting problems. I can concede that. Sometimes one thing we often hear about are people that work in different states and they don't report the income in the respective states. In fact, most people don't know that professional athletes have to report their income in every single state that they do business or participate in a sporting event. A lot of people don't know that, and so I get a lot of conversations about unlawful income and not reporting and not following reporting requirements. I will say, from a state perspective, I've seen audits pick up when we have a revenue shortfall. People starting to find out where the holes are and where the loop is. I have also seen from a federal level them trying to differentiate between high and low income earners when they do the audits as well. But again, it's just all kinds of trends, especially on the federal level.
I mean, I think the answer really is it's not a tax policy question; it's a justice policy question.
Yeah.
It's a way of expanding federal authority. Criminal justice belongs to the states, but the federal government has created these entrees. The tax code is one, civil rights is another, where they can try what are essentially state crimes under federal statutes. So a murder in a state, which could, of an African American, for example, during the civil rights period, which is only a state crime, can be tried as a violation of that person's civil rights under the federal law. I don't think there's any suggestion that unlawful income is a drop in anybody's revenue bucket. I mean, they're not making a lot off fantasy football and cocaine sales and people reporting that stuff. But it's a way of the federal government of expanding its authority on the justice side rather than on the tax side. It enabled them to go after Al Capone, who had broken no federal laws except for prohibition. But he's going back and forth across the Canadian border, and the state of New York is not going to prosecute him, or the state of Illinois. But it's a way for the feds to go after him when state authorities are reluctant to. Anything else? Okay, so why don't we end by asking Mr. Fisher and Mr. Wallace if there was one thing they could change about the state or federal tax code, what would it be?
Ooh, the state or federal or both?
Pick one or both.
State or federal tax code. I would say this. When I was a low-level staffer beginning my career in the Senate Finance Committee, I fielded a lot of telephone calls and emails that were not emails, they were actually letters directed to Senator Grassley and other members of Congress from people that were just plain confused on how the tax system works at the federal level. And these are ordinary, everyday Iowans who play by the rules and do what they're supposed to, and they're too busy rearing families, taking care of senior parents, and doing all the right things, but they just don't know a lot about how to fill out a 1040, or they don't know a lot about financial literacy for that matter. So when all of a sudden they see a big chunk out of their check and they didn't set themselves up properly at the beginning of the year and they end up owing taxes, on an individual end, I just wish that there was a better, this isn't wishy-washy, I really mean this, I wish there was a better way to educate folks on how the tax system works, both at the state level and at the federal level, so that people had a better understanding on the individual end. For my corporations, most of them have some pretty fancy experts that can sit there and figure out how to reduce liability, how to modify liability, and how to figure out exactly what they're going to owe to within a few $100,000. For ordinary, everyday Iowans, that's not always the case.
And that's why my one change would be corporate income tax simplification, so that there were absolutely no exemptions, deductions, or credits whatsoever, and use it to lower rates, and then there's no way to game the system. We could fire all those corporate tax attorneys.
But not the lobbyists.
But not the lobbyists, no.
Yeah.